Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of My Impact, our interview series where we speak to alumni to shine a light on what's possible with an Equal Justice Works Fellowship. My name is Brooke Meckler, and I am the director of the Law School Engagement and Advocacy team at Equal Justice Works, and I'm thrilled to be speaking with Darlene Hemerka today, a 2017 fellow whose fellowship focused on advocating for children with disabilities. Darlene, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Brooke.
All right, so my first question is, what compelled you to pursue public interest and why did you decide to go to law school?
I think I knew early on in my life that I would do something in public interest, public service. That's really what fuels me. It's really why, I wanted to pursue a career. I didn't know exactly what, but I knew I wanted to help others. And as far as why law school, when I was young, my sisters got me a gavel that said "To our future judge," because I wanted to be the person that delivered justice. I just thought that was so cool. That was when I was about 8 years old. As I grew up a little bit and learned more about the justice system and how it works, I strayed from that and thought about some other career possibilities. But then when I was in college, I started a disability organization for students to raise awareness about disability rights and to educate folks on campus. And yet, even though I was the president of that organization and on the Chancellor's Advisory Council for Disability, I was discriminated against by my university. And I thought to myself, if they can do that to me, as somebody who is extremely active and outspoken about my disability and disability rights, how do they treat other people? And that was really the moment that I knew I wanted to go to law school and pursue disability rights.
Well, that's really inspiring. You've done such impactful work advocating for children with disabilities and parents in schools, both during and after your fellowship and in college, of course. Can you talk about your work in disability rights?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, I started with a club in college, and then I thought, oh, I really want to go to the Department of Justice and do disability rights there and really write some great policy. Because I thought, oh, if we can get the right policy, maybe we can make some change. So I spent my first summer of law school at a policy organization, a disability policy organization in Berkeley, California. And what I realized from that experience is that you could have the best policy in the world, but if nobody was enforcing it, then it didn't really do so much. And so I decided to transition a focus from policy advocacy to litigation. And then I decided to do my Equal Justice Works Fellowship around transition planning, which is the idea that students ages 14 and 21 who have IEPs, individualized education programs, are entitled to receive services from their schools that help them prepare for life after school. That's education, employment, and independent living skills. And even though this is the law, I know that this wasn't being implemented. And I knew that in part because prior to law school, I did another AmeriCorps program called City Year Greater Philadelphia. And in that program, I worked with students who were freshmen in high school, trying to get them on track and keep them on track for graduation. And what I realized was that many of my students had IEPs, but didn't know what that meant and didn't know what that entitled them to. And for many reasons, their families couldn't advocate for them in that way. And I thought about the difference from their experience and my experience in high school. When I was in high school, I probably should have started with this, Brooke, but I was born with a disability and use a walker to ambulate. And I was fortunate because I have two older siblings. And so when I went to new schools. So when I transitioned to high school, people already knew who I was. They had already talked to my family about what I needed to be successful. And even though I didn't struggle academically, there was a concern that my family had about the independent living piece, and what would that look like for me. And instead of shying away from it, my IEP team really encouraged me to spend a summer between my junior and senior year away from my family on a college campus, getting that experience. And they said, if you get that experience now for the summer, we can see what works, what doesn't, and what do we still need to focus on. And sort of through that process, my IEP team really did individualize things for me. And so when I looked back on my experience and thought about what my students were getting through City Year, I just really noticed a difference depending on if you had someone to advocate for you, if your IEP team was willing to individualize things for you, if your family knew what your rights were, if you, as the young adult, knew what your rights were. And so that's what really inspired my fellowship project. It was training families about what their rights were. It was educating students about what their rights were and why they should really be in the driver's seat as much as possible as to what this transition planning looks like. And then it was going to IEP meetings to represent students and their families, and then potentially bringing cases, if necessary, to implement those transition services.
Well, that's incredible. And it's so great how you used your own experience and your knowledge to go and help so many more families who are going through something similar. Can you talk about how you think your fellowship shaped or affected your future career goals?
Sure. One of the things that I loved about my fellowship was being able to do a combination of policy, like systemic policy work, but also doing direct services work. And my fellowship organization, my host organization, the Public Interest Law Center, really focused on systemic advocacy and systemic litigation. And while I really see value in systemic litigation and thought that that was going to be sort of my career path, what I learned from my fellowship project was I really, really enjoyed interacting with individual clients and connecting with individual clients on a regular basis. And so after my fellowship, I stayed with the law center for another year and a half, continued to do education, litigation, and work. And then in March of 2021, I transitioned to another legal nonprofit in Philadelphia. It's called the Legal Clinic for the Disabled, and they do all direct service, and all of their clients have some sort of disability. They don't do education work per se. It's more general civil litigation, so some eviction work. We do powers of attorney, guardianship for students and young adults as they age from pediatric care to adult care, making sure that their parents can still assist them with making healthcare decisions. So still follows my passion, but just doing it in a little bit of a different light.
That's awesome. Back to your fellowship, can you share a little bit about how you leveraged the connections you made with other fellows during your time in the program? And did you have an opportunity to work with your fellowship sponsor, Greenberg Traurig?
Sure. I actually want to go back a little bit further, Brooke, than before I became a fellow. That first summer of law school, when I was in Berkeley at the policy organization, I was at the Ed Roberts campus, which is a campus that hosts a number of disability organizations at this one building. And one of the other organizations had an Equal Justice Works fellow currently. there, and I found that out, and I sat down with him and did an informational interview about what it was like to be a fellow. And it was after my conversation with him that I said, oh, I'm going to get one of those when I graduate. That is what I want. I want to be able to design my own job and follow my passion and figure out some way to change these big issues that no one else is really working on. So it started even before I was an actual fellow, this connection. And I would encourage anyone that wants to be a fellow. It's been my experience that everyone is super willing to talk to you if you're willing to reach out and ask. And so that was some guidance that that fellow gave me, and I want to share that with others. So that was through the application process as well. I talked to people who had done projects in disability rights before to talk to them about how they created their fellowship proposal. And then once I actually became a fellow, all the fellows go to leadership development training each year. And my first year, I was able to meet another fellow who was a second-year fellow who was doing disability rights work. And I sat down with her and I said, okay, so are there certain organizations or bar associations that I should join? Or like, what should I be doing? Because there's no one else in my host organization that is doing disability rights. So what should I know? And who should I know? And so that's what I did my first year. And then I was fortunate that my second year in leadership development training, I was able to mentor someone in a similar way, someone who had reached out to me about their application. When they were applying, they were accepted as a fellow, and then we got to meet in person at leadership development training and talk about, resources and things I'd learned over my first year. So I do think it's a really great community, and I'm really fortunate to be a part of it. As far as my sponsor, Greenberg Traurig, we didn't get to work like on a particular case or on like a particular clinic or anything like that. I know sometimes fellows are able to engage their sponsors that way, but we found some other ways to engage. So for example, I did a video where I explained for families. I did 3 15-minute videos regarding what their rights were around transition planning, and I filmed that video at Greenberg Traurig. Another example is I created, along with my colleague and someone from another organization, we created a CLE for attorneys to know what transition planning is and what they should be thinking about. And we hosted that CLE at Greenberg Traurig. So there are definitely ways to get your sponsor involved, and I would highly encourage anyone who is a fellow or is getting ready to be a fellow to think creatively about how you might utilize your sponsor.
That's great advice, and also great to hear that you were mentored your first leadership development training, and then the next year you were the mentor. And just to see that sort of growth is really amazing. So thanks for sharing that. My next question is, how has your work shifted because of the pandemic? And what lessons have you learned over the last year that you think would be helpful to share with new lawyers and law students interested in following a similar career path as you?
Oh, wow. That is like
Big one.
Big question. What have I learned in the past year? Well, education law is really tough. And I've found it was tough before the pandemic. And then for me, it was really tough during the pandemic, just because I saw or I heard from advocates and clients that, their students were struggling with virtual learning, and yet they also had this real fear of sending their student back too soon, particularly if their student had some sort of disability that either put them at higher risk or made it less likely that they would understand the different protocols in place. And so it really was sort of this, how do we find the best solution for everyone? And I think folks in the education space are still working on that. And it was definitely difficult to watch, but I do want to say that, I admire all the administrators and folks that had to make those decisions as well, because, boards of education, those aren't paid jobs, the Board of Education especially, and, they were doing the best they could with the information we had. And I think transitioning from my role in the education space every day to now doing more work around eviction prevention or eviction diversion, and then powers of attorney and other things like that. I think one of the things that I've realized is how technology can be an equalizer and really give people, particularly people with disabilities, the opportunity to engage in things that they might not otherwise be able to engage in. But it also can be a really big barrier if a person doesn't have the technology, either for economic reasons, or maybe they don't have the training to use that technology. And so I'm really, really curious and want to see how we leverage some of these new practices of working from home. How can we make the workforce and the workplace more inclusive, particularly for people with disabilities, as we sort of go back to pre-COVID times? What does that look like? And then one other issue, Brooke, that I think is really also worth mentioning is one other issue that we hear about at the legal clinic quite a bit is Social Security disability and applying for that, and just the individuals that are now facing long-term effects from COVID, and what does that look like, and how do we support those individuals, is also another question that I've been pondering as we transition, to this next phase. I won't even say pre-COVID, because I'm not sure that we're there yet, or we should get there, because I think there is some good that, or some ways that we can take what we learned in COVID and make, like I said, the workplace more inclusive, maybe the workforce. And the biggest thing that I would say for anyone that wants to follow the kind of career path that I've had is, the biggest thing I've learned this year is about flexibility, right? And about creativity. And I think that is public interest lawyering regardless, but then you add a pandemic, and a lot of, like I said, a lot of the clients I have now don't have the technology. And so how do we get evidence or just information? And so I think it's really about being creative. It's really about finding a network of people doing similar work or with similar passion, and talking to them and asking questions, and just constantly trying to expand your network and look for best practices or creative solutions.
Yeah, that all sounds really interesting. And it sounds like you're in a really unique position to find out some of those answers and see how we can take what we've learned and bring it into this new hybrid situation where some things didn't work and some things did, and try to make it better for everyone. Let's talk a little bit more about your fellowship and how you designed it with your host organization. So can you share some more tips? I know you've given some already, but some tips that you would give to students who are in internships this summer on how they can approach their organizations to design a fellowship.
Sure, but full disclosure, I'm probably not the best person to give this advice, because I did not previously intern with my organization. And I spent my second summer at the Department of Justice doing in the disability rights section. And so I thought that that was a great opportunity, but I also knew that it was sort of a trade-off, because that is what you hear when applying for fellowships, right? Figure out where you want to apply and then try an intern for them your second summer so that you can then start working on fellowship applications. And what I would say is, if you have either a project that you are particularly interested in, or a subject area like disability rights for me, find organizations that align with those values, and then just don't be shy, right? I mean, the worst thing they can do is tell you, oh no, we're applying, or we're selecting someone that we've had as an intern, or we're not hiring right, we're not accepting fellows right now because we're not doing one this year. But I just say, cast your net wide and expect to hear the word no quite a bit. But part of that persistence is going to pay off as a public interest lawyer as well, because you're going to hear no a lot, or oh no, that's not possible. That's not how we've done things. No, it just has to become part of your hearing. No has to become part of your mentality almost, and sort of like an expectation, so that it doesn't devastate you every time you hear it. And so I don't know that that really answered your question, Brooke, but I think that if you are at a host organization and they are accepting fellows, and you think it is a place that you want to work, and by the way, I'm not saying by any means that you shouldn't try and go that route, because I do think it is worthwhile to have interned somewhere, see if you really like it, see if the work they do matches up with your values. I think that's a great thing to do. And I would say talk to them early, right? Talk to them pretty early, because it does take a long time to develop a really thoughtful fellowship proposal. It takes time, it takes editing. So the host organization really has to be on board as well. So definitely, if you are interning somewhere that you think you'd want to be a fellow, talk to them early. But also, if you're not, that's okay too. Just make sure that you reach out early to organizations that you think you would want to be a fellow with.
That is really great advice. And I think that those listening in today who are applying for the fellowship may know how competitive it is. So what final advice would you share with candidates so they're prepared to submit a great proposal? And what advice would you share to law students who are just pursuing public interest careers generally?
Absolutely. For those that are submitting fellowship proposals, I would say reach out to previous fellows in the issue area that you're most interested in, and see if you can read their proposals. See if you can read proposals that have already been selected, so you understand what it is that Equal Justice Works looks for in their proposals. I will reiterate again that it does take a lot of editing and a lot of time. So make sure that you and your host organization are on the same page for that. You don't want to wait till the last minute for them to review it or for them to do their part, because it's not, that's not how it comes together. And then as far as individuals that want to or are pursuing careers in public interest, I would say, and I don't know that I would have believed this as a law student, by the way, but this is one thing I've learned at the law center. There's no straight path to public interest. Yes, a fellowship is one way to get in the door, but if you don't get a fellowship the first time you apply, that doesn't mean you're never going to get a fellowship. If you don't get a fellowship at all, that doesn't mean you can't do public interest. There are plenty of attorneys that do private practice, but do a lot of pro bono work and focus on the pro bono hours while they're in public or while they're in private practice. Get some of those skills that you can get at a private firm because of the resources they have, but really remember your passion for public interest and then make that transition. And so I just say, if public interest is what drives you and is your passion, just don't give up on that. Continue to look for ways to develop those skills and to make it shine on your resume that you really are committed to public interest, even if it's not your full-time day job right when you start.
Well, great. That is very inspiring advice. And Darlene, it was so great speaking with you today. I always love talking to you, and I miss seeing you in person, but maybe we will someday soon. We can't wait to see where your career goes from here. We're just so proud that you were an Equal Justice Works Fellow. So thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.